Many readers know the name Alfred A. Knopf, the storied publishing house that made Langston Hughes, Willa Cather, John Updike, and many other writers into household names. What may be less well known is that in the world the Knopfs moved in, it was an open secret that Blanche Knopf, Alfred's wife, was a huge part of the brains, grace, and sheer drive behind the operation. She was responsible for a good part of the firm's success and its glamour. A new biography of Blanche Knopf is called The Lady with the Borzoi, and our reviewer, Liesl Schillinger, is here to talk about it and the amazing Blanche. Hi, Liesl.
Hello, Pamela.
So what was publishing like before the founding of Knopf? Can you tell us a little bit of the backdrop? Who were the major publishers at that time?
The big thing that was different about Knopf was that it was an intellectually ambitious Jewish firm. Before the First World War, the biggest and best publishing houses were pretty waspy. There was Houghton Mifflin, there was Scribner's, there was Doubleday. And so when Alfred and Blanche came along with Knopf, they were breaking a path, being Jewish and creating a publishing house that aspired to the pinnacle of the literary world. They had imitators soon after, though. A company called Liverite was a very big deal.
Which is recently revived.
Exactly. And Liverite also branched off into the modern library at a time. So they kind of started a small trend, you could say. Another thing that was happening, though, at that time was that publishing began to change. The white glove, waspy firms began to change because there was a paper shortage, because it was World War I. And so they started more going into textbooks. So that left an opening for someone with literary ambitions. And also, Alfred was kind of a dandy, and he liked beauty. He was an aesthete. And so he made sure that Knopf books were printed on fine paper and that the covers looked good and that the type was good. He was creating an artifact as well as bringing in literary writers. So,
and was that different from what other publishers were doing in terms of the covers and the sort of overall design at that time?
Absolutely. They were originators. And I would say that Blanche also had very good and strong tastes, and they were both aesthetic, but definitely Alfred was very, very forceful in making sure that it was going to be a beautiful imprint as well as an ambitious one.
The argument that Laura Claridge puts forth in this biography is that Blanche Knopf, rather than Alfred, was in many ways the real tastemaker behind Knopf, that she was the one with the fine European literary sense. Let's talk a little bit about who she was. Where did she grow up?
Blanche grew up in Manhattan, in the Upper West Side, I think, and also Upper East Side. Her parents had money. Her father, he made ruffles. He made textiles, cloth of some kind. And she went to a pretty exclusive girls' school called Gardner's, which catered to well-brought-up Jewish girls, but also non-society people from everywhere. So there were some eminent girls. And so she was brought up learning to ride horses, being part of sort of polite society in a certain way in New York. And she met Alfred when she was 17 at some kind of fancy ball out in Long Island near Lawrence, where his family had an estate. So he was also from a wealthy family, and his father.
This helps in publishing.
It helps, yeah. No, it's how pleasant it is to have money. Hey ho, but no, they both had money behind them. Blanche brought money into the marriage, and Alfred's family also had money, but they spent a lot. They threw everything they had into this company. And during the Depression, there were times when they barely broke even, but they always had something to fall back on.
And so they met when she was only 18?
17. And then I told you she went to this fancy girls' school, a kind of finishing school, kind of if you couldn't get into Brearley because of whatever social reason, you went to Gardner's. It was very nice. She was bookish, and she became increasingly bookish in her late teens. She loved reading. She was passionate about it. And so was young Alfred Knopf. And he was also muscular and tan. Their romance seems to be legitimate while they were courting in the early years.
Once they were married, it was no longer.
It was out the door. It was gone. No, it was a cold, seething hatred. No, I'm joking. They didn't get along well at all. That's completely true. But they did bond over books and over their business.
And when did they marry, and when did they found the publishing house?
They got married in April of 1916, but the publishing house was founded a year earlier when they were only engaged. And so I think where some of the confusion may come from when people wonder if she really was pulling her weight equally in Knopf or even more, because it was founded before they were married, but she was always, at least according to this biographer, and she seems to have lots of good backup, Blanche was inseparable from its rise and from really its endurance.
And Claridge's argument in this book is really to say that Blanche was the driving force behind many of the...
What Claridge says is that Blanche was the one who was the literary arbiter. She was the one who had a passion for poetry and for European fiction, and who would also decide which unproven writers, which had original work that she thought was worth publishing. She would bring to American readers books that hadn't been in translation or books they hadn't heard of. She brought Thomas Mann, Buddenbrooks, to America. She got Camus and Sartre and Beauvoir in English. She had early work of T.S. Eliot published. She went to England a lot. She and Alfred would go on scouting trips. She brought back Muriel Spark, Rebecca West. Elizabeth Bowen became a close friend. And in America, she also championed Willa Cather. Willa Cather actually sought her out and really trusted Blanche's taste. So yes, you're completely right. Laura Claridge makes the case that it was Blanche's literary taste, but that's not to say that Alfred wasn't absolutely crucial. He initially courted John Galsworthy. He was initially friends with H.L. Mencken, who became a very, very close friend of Blanche's. Alfred was a salesman, and he had a vision for how to sell the product. He is into branding. You know, he thought about how the books would look. He thought about posters. He came up with ad campaigns that were very clever in the American Mercury, which is a magazine which Mencken and George Nathan founded. Alfred went on the road. He traveled. He met booksellers. He got great ad campaigns going. He understood the value of publicity for a book and of branding. And so he did a whole lot to make the Knopf name get recognition and to make the Knopf imprint recognizable, to make it admired, but also to get copies sold. So he was always thinking about the bottom line. He would disagree a lot of times with Blanche about which book to buy. If an author asked for too much money, he would get cold feet and back away. He did not want The Wasteland, for example, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which was, you might say, not such a good business decision. But they both had strong opinions. It's just that Alfred cared more about history and music when it came to books, and Blanche was the one who really cared about literature, fiction, and poetry. Right.
And was Knopf as a publishing house, as a business, immediately successful?
Well, they did very well pretty early on. They had one hit book their first year called Green Mansions. Early on, they acquired a kind of kooky book, you might think, that had been recommended to them by a friend of Mencken, called The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. And that book sold millions. And that book has done so much to keep Knopf healthy over the years. And I believe in the book, Claridge writes it was even selling 5,000 copies a week in this new century. So that has been an evergreen, durable cash cow for them.
But the marriage between Blanche and Alfred was not altogether happy.
It sounds like they were not happy physically with each other, and they got on each other's nerves. There seems to have been a clash of wills from very early on. Now, if you look at the correspondence, which is pretty one-sided, it's the correspondence from Blanche to Alfred while he was on the road, you can see her being affectionate with him or teasing, but it seems that when they were in each other's presence, they would goad each other. And she describes the regular meetings at Knopf where Blanche would poke and prod at him to get him to lose his mind, just saying that she was too hot, for example. And so he would grudgingly turn up the heat, and then he would come back to the meeting dressed in a bathing suit and have the rest of the meeting dressed like that to make his point. They kind of feuded. At the same time, they both loved this company, and that was where their first loyalty went. They had a son whom they called Pat. That doesn't seem like they were the warmest parents, but he came into the business, eventually, and then formed his own company. Yes?
Why was the correspondence one-sided? Was Claridge unable to have access to Alfred's letters?
I doubt that. It seems to me there's a point made that Alfred didn't really write her very often, or he would write little brief communiques of a few words. Mm-hmm. She was the greater letter writer by nature. She was extremely social, though, and he was retiring. Not too long into the marriage, he got his own place. Well, it was their place, but it was in Westchester, in Purchase, out of town. And he really liked to go there. She kept up an apartment on 57th Street. She had different addresses over the years, but from very early on, she loved to entertain. She was a jazz baby. She would have Gershwin, who was a friend, playing piano till 3 in the morning at her parties. Paul Robeson, he would sing. She had Stravinsky came to one of her parties. She would dance until the wee hours of morning, and she loved to entertain. And the literary and performing world, black and white, she was very ahead of the game in being racially aware and inclusive, would come to her apartment. She really was a saloniste as well as a publisher. You can tell from this book that she had many, many significant close friendships, but she could also be remote, hard to know, frightening. I'm not so sure that she was the warmest and fuzziest person in the world, but she definitely was warmer and fuzzier than Alfred.
But the book is full of lots of sort of juicy anecdotes about the parties of the time, about her relationships with all of these writers. What was your favorite?
The thing that struck me really the most was how many love affairs she had. I don't think that publishing is like this. I don't think America is like this. I mean, I think you get outside of the Kardashians. I don't know where this happens. But she had serious love affairs with Stokowski, with Jascha Heifetz, with Benno Moisevich, with a European playboy named Hoa, whom she was very, very in love with. And that went on for quite a while. And apparently, Alfred just turned a blind eye. And even the stories that are included in the book from friends of hers who would describe in this jaded way the goings-on of the 1920s amid the illustrious writers we've all come to think of as just august names were really scandalous and shocking and fun. And I was surprised that a woman who was so tightly wound and intense and driven also let loose so wildly.
Well, I guess given the acknowledgement, or the lack of acknowledgement that she got from Alfred during her lifetime, this book is a kind of revenge, because it's the first biography of Blanche Knopf, and there still isn't a biography of Alfred.
She won, you might say. There's clearly a lot to say about Alfred, and we learn in this book that he saw prostitutes, he had his own private life. There are all kinds of bad behaviors of his that are alluded to in the book. It would be definitely pretty interesting to see Alfred's side.
And probably something more about the books, too.
Well, and also I don't want to underplay how much is in this biography about the books, because the books were really Blanche's life, and they were Alfred's life. And as much as this is a chronicle of a difficult, fractious, quarrelsome, disharmonious marriage, it's also the blow-by-blow show of how this woman, with her husband, hunted great writers and made this publishing house.
The book again is The Lady with the Borzoi, Blanche Knopf, Literary Tastemaker Extraordinaire by Laura Claridge. Reviewed this week by Liesl Schillinger.
Thanks, Pamela.